So my father bought this house in Lusk, and he nearly didn't buy it because when they went to look at it, as they drove up the back drive, apparently half a dozen rats ran across. Nearly put him off, but thank God they bought it anyway. It belonged to the church originally. The glebe lands, the 10 acres round it, all belonged to a minister of the Protestant church attached to the round tower in Lusk. And it was a beautiful house, not big, 3-bedroom house, but wonderful garden and a grass tennis court in front, which was my father's pride and joy. And wonderful garden that my mother created, really. So we had a very, very happy childhood there. It was 3 miles to the sea at Rush, and we used to walk the dogs there. We used to collect wild spinach on the beach. I have to say, I actually was sent to boarding school at the age of 6, which a lot of people consider very young. But I have a sister 15 months older than me, and she was always there with me. And as I say, she always bullied me, but she wouldn't let anybody else bully me. So I always felt quite safe and protected. So we came home every holidays, and we had friends here. Both my parents were fanatical riders, had been all their lives. And we were members of the pony club, and I had a pony who I loved very much. 3/4 Arab and 1/4 Welsh mountain he was. And his grandmother had been actually born on the desert, which I found so romantic. We had very happy holidays here. In those days, you could ride into the village, no problems, no houses. It was wonderful countryside. It was farmland round us. And of course, Rush was a very interesting area. My father had succeeded, after a long time out of the army, in getting a job that suited him very well in Trinity College, Dublin, as the general administrator. Well, she wasn't all the years she was bringing us up. She was just an army wife. But she was very good at everything she put her hand to. She was a wonderful cook, wonderful gardener. She made most of our clothes in those days. She constantly knitted. Believe it or not, I've still got a sewing machine that I've had for 60 years that she used. So she was born in Lancashire, and she never had an art lesson in her life, but she had painted from a very, very early age, when she was about 4 or 5. And she didn't have time in her life for doing much painting. She always painted, but only for the family. And I don't think it struck us that she was particularly talented or anything in those days. But I mean, we had lovely pictures. She painted my pony for me. She painted Michael's dog. We were always aware that she was a wonderful artist, but, you know, we didn't think it was anything exceptional. I then went to Trinity and was a student there, I hate to confess it, for 5 years, because I started off doing science and switched course. And when we'd all become independent, mind you, my brother's nearly 5 years younger than me, but he was also off at boarding school. And then he went on to Cambridge. So then my mother was freed to take up her painting seriously. But it came about, she had a friend who lived south of Dublin in Bray, who painted watercolours. And she was quite outgoing and bold, and she said to my mother, "Come on, Wendy, let's go up into the Wicklow Mountains and paint. You know, you like painting, I like painting. Come with me." So she sort of pushed my mother into getting started again in a proper way. And then, to give her her due, she could see that my mother was a great deal better than she was. But she still loved it and enjoyed it. She started a little gallery somewhere in Wicklow, and she had the first exhibition of my mother's watercolours that they'd done up in the Wicklow Mountains. And then we began sort of thinking, gosh, this is wonderful, this super hobby that Ma's had all these years can now manifest itself. Well, more for her pleasure.
Yeah.
And then she went off, my brother then had graduated, and he went off to the other side of the world for 4 years as an economist to a country that was then called the Gilbert and Ellice Islands. It's now called Kiribati. It's an independent country. And my mother went out to visit him. And while she was there, she got the opportunity to do a lot of painting of beautiful flowers that they have there, hibiscus, frangipani, things we don't see here in Ireland. And when she got back, my father being in Trinity, somebody who was on the stamp committee for Ireland saw her paintings and said those would make lovely stamps. But actually, somebody, now that I think of it, somebody in the Gilbert Islands who organised their stamps had seen her flower paintings and thought we should do an issue of those stamps, because those little island nations in the Pacific Ocean made a lot of their income out of stamps and coins that they minted for collectors. I mean, when you think of it now, nobody collects stamps anymore. But so they were always looking for fresh talent to do their stamps. So the first really public recognition was a set of stamps she did for the Gilbert Islands, Gilbert and Ellice Islands they were then. She did 4 stamps of these headdresses that were made specially, and they were a great success. And then somebody on the Irish stamp committee saw them and thought, wow, well, we could have some Irish flowers on stamps. And that's really where she got going. And then those stamps, the flowers were the first ones. After the stamps, well, I suppose she then met a botanist who worked in Glasnevin. He was the head of Glasnevin. He was actually from Northern Ireland, Dr. Charles Nelson.
Yes.
And he, half my mother's age, but they got on really well. And she liked the way he wrote notes on botanical subjects. And I must say, he's not so scientific that the ordinary layman can't read it. He does write beautifully. And he liked my mother's style of painting. So they sort of got together and plotted a book called, and Charles came up with the title, An Irish FLORILEGIUM. And it was about 40 of my mother's paintings, which took her 2 or 3 years to paint because there were various stages in the flower. And I think that book really brought her to the public notice. And then, of course, the ultimate was when in, was it 1992, Trinity College decided to give her an honorary doctorate. Mm-hmm. And if you can believe it, my mother never went to school. She had never been to school. She had a governess, and when she could read, she was away because she read fanatically. But she always said all her life she was an autodidact. She rather liked using this long word. It just meant she was self-taught. And she had great gaps in her knowledge, which sometimes embarrassed her hideously. In fact, I mean, it was really sad in a way because she obviously had a really good brain. But when they got to fractions in mathematics, for instance, her sister, her older sister, couldn't understand them. She didn't know what they were talking about. And my mother was about 12 or 13. And their mother said, well, I think you know enough now to make good cocktail party conversation, you know, that'll do, and dismissed the governess. And that was all the schooling my mother ever had. Here's a black rhino, which is much rarer than the white rhino. Of course, they're all grey, they're not white. And I'm telling you, I'm going to go into tourist guide mode now, and I've talked far too much.
Give it to us, we're happy to have it.
Do you know why they're called black rhinos or white rhinos? Because the first one they saw, because it was more plentiful, was the white rhino. And the first people to be in South Africa were the Dutch. Well, the Dutch word for wide is weit. And the white rhino has a very wide mouth. It is what we in English call the square-lipped rhino. But the Dutch called it the white rhino. And the British, you know, white, it's not white, but, you know, if that's what they call it, that's what they call it. And so the black rhino just got called the black rhino by contrast, because it was a different species. So it's nothing to do with their colour. I'm crazy, really, how these things evolve. But the black rhino is the hook-lipped rhino. And it's smaller and shyer than the white rhino and supposed to be more aggressive. But in my son's experience, it isn't. Actually, it's just much, much shyer, more secretive. This is a little lion cub, female lion cub. Her name is Mara. I don't know if she's still alive. She was orphaned up in Kenya. Her mother was shot. And she was sent down to Zimbabwe by George Adamson, who knew a person who had a wildlife rehabilitation center in Zimbabwe, who was known as the Ernest Hemingway of Africa. There's a chap called Robin, somebody or other. Anyway, and he got this little Mara and her two little brothers who were orphaned. And my son was given the job of calming them down and getting them used to people. Now the two boys, the male cubs, he was told never turn your back to them. They see a back, it's absolute instinct, they want to jump on it. The female won't do that, although actually lions do most of the hunting. But you can make friends with the little girl. And she used to come and rub round his ankles like a domestic cat. And he absolutely adored her, and she loved him. They're very friendly towards humans. And when he went back 2 years later, and Mara had grown up and been put in an enclosure, and he was dying to see her, and he went up to the wire of this big enclosure. It was about 20 acres or so, and it was all thick bush, and he called her, Mara, Mara, Mara. And I get quite emotional about it. This lioness came bounding out of the bush, and she leapt up against the wire, and he put his hand through, and he ruffled her head, and she tried to nuzzle him. It was absolutely very exciting, and I thought, I can't believe my son is on this term with a wild lioness. Yeah. But it's wonderful how they bonded. Anyway, and then they let him out with George Adamson, who was the one who sent her down to Zimbabwe, Rhodesia as it was then. And he later employed Tady when Tady was about 17, had just left school. And he didn't know what he wanted to do in life, but he did know he loved animals. And Robin had just received 2 orphaned elephant cubs. And he gave Tady the job of taking them down to the local dam, pond, lake, every morning and teaching them how to cover themselves with mud by scooping up water and splashing it on them. And I don't know if you know why elephants do that. They get out and the sun dries the mud, and then they go and rub on a tree, and get all the mud off and rub off all the skin parasites. So it's to clean their skin. So they have to learn it or they'll get tormented by ticks and things. Anyway, this is how much he loved his elephants. This, every picture has a story attached to it, doesn't it? This is almost my favourite animal, although I do love the elephants. This is, of course, the leopard. And this was when I had become a professional tourist guide, and I had a German girl with me, although she'd lived in Canada for some years, and she was in her early 30s. And when we were having breakfast, an hour before I took this picture, she had an epileptic fit. And I mean, it was terrifying. I had other people on the tour. I didn't know what to do. But anyway, we borrowed a pillow and we put her lying down on the back seat of my minibus with this pillow. And I had to go on because of the others. And we'd only been out, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes, and this gorgeous leopard walked out of the bush. And she sat up and she sort of gave a great sigh. She, you know, thrilled to see it, and then she just gave a sigh and sank back on her pillow, and she was content then. Cheetah and leopards, you know, can be mistaken, but the leopard is much shorter and much heavier, double the weight. Look at the difference in the legs. Well, not that you can see the young cheetahs. Cheetahs have long, slim legs, much smaller heads, and the giveaway is those two black lines running down from their eyes, which scientists think are to deflect the light when they're running at high speed, because of course you're looking at the fastest animal on the planet here. They can get up to 110 kilometers an hour, but they can't keep that up for long, only 300, 400 yards. And if they haven't brought down the prey by then, they'll abandon the attempt because it requires too much energy to go on. And of course they can't replace the energy till they catch some food. So they were waiting in the grass, and their mother was hunting just over the road, and she'd obviously said to them, now lie down there and don't you move, just stay there till I come back. I mean, you can't believe animals can instill this in their children. And they kept sitting up, craning up like this to see where she was, but then they'd go down again. It was a wonderful thing to see. You really have to say the elephant is the symbol of Africa. I don't know if it's the lion or the elephant, but they're all as wonderful as each other. And this was an old bull we saw standing under a leadwood tree, very interesting tree, very dense wood. And that leadwood tree, if you measure the circumference, every foot or 30 centimeters is 100 years of growth. So that's probably 400 or 500 years old, that leadwood tree. And they get much bigger. They grow over 1,000 years. But anyway, that's the tree, not the elephant. And he's probably rubbing the mud off his hide, as I said, to get off the parasites. But he was a splendid